Hey Lake Point, Pastor Micah here to get you caught up on the fourth week of our series, The Upside Down Kingdom. In this series, we were exploring what scholars refer to as the antithesis portion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. This week, Pastor Nate commented on Jesus' teaching on divorce, which is obviously a very sensitive topic since so many have been impacted by it. But here's the thing, Jesus always pointed to God's ideal, yet refused to condemn those who fell short. And so Pastor Nathan attempted to, in Truth and Grace, discuss what happens when we fall short in the area of marriage. This is what Jesus says in Matthew 5:31. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. Now, Jesus here is quoting from the law of Moses, specifically Deuteronomy 24 verse 1, which reads that if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. Now, as Nate shared, to be clear, this isn't a command, it's case law. It's designed to mitigate the devastating effects that divorce had on women. To appreciate this provision in the law of Moses, we first must understand the culture of the ancient Near East. Before Jesus, before even Moses, the ancient Near East was governed by the Hammurabi Code. The code consisted of 282 laws. One of the laws was that a husband could divorce his wife at any time for any reason. All he had to do was walk out of the house. A husband could just walk out the door and leave his wife and kids to fend for themselves. Now, let's assume that a wife in that kind of predicament managed somehow to get by without her husband, which would have been incredibly difficult. But based on the code, her ex-husband could return at any time, reclaim her, the kids, the farm, and all of her possessions. Which meant that if you were a wife and your husband left, even though you could technically remarry, no man would do it in case your first husband were to return and reclaim you. So if you were a woman in that time in history and your marriage broke up, you were in trouble. Often prostitution or living on the streets were your only options. One of the striking aspects of the law of Moses compared to the laws of the ancient Near East was its concern for women, even in regards to divorce. Now, once again, in this passage, God is not endorsing divorce. Divorce was never God's idea. As we hear later from Jesus, Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to our hard hearts, but it was not originally what God had intended. We see in Genesis that God intended marriage to be one man plus one woman for one lifetime. But in an effort to protect women living in the ancient Near East who had little to no rights, Moses provides provisions to guard against the oppression of women. His words are not validating divorce or saying that God is okay with it. Rather, it's about what to do in the aftermath of divorce. At first glance, these words may sound a bit harsh, but the certificate was a way of protecting the woman as it confirmed that the husband had divorced her and that it was safe for another man to marry her. That man didn't have to worry that her first husband would return and demand her back. In fact, the certificate always included the phrase, "You are free to marry any Jewish man you wish." Now, you'll notice that this law also references the grounds for divorce. It says if he had found something indecent about her. In Hebrew, it clarifies that what that is. It read, for the cause of sexual immorality. But what about other causes, though? Was there a provision for divorce when there was abuse or even abandonment? I mean, that's a question that the church has debated for centuries. What often gets overlooked in this discussion is Exodus chapter 21. In Exodus 21, Moses covers the question, what happens if a man takes a second wife? And the law that Moses gives is designed to protect the interests of the first wife. I mean, look at what he says. Exodus 21, 10-11 says, if he marries another woman, he must not deprive the first wife of food, clothing, and sexual intimacy. And if he does not provide her with these three things, she is free to go without any payment of money. Once again, the law of Moses is seeking to protect women. In this case, the husband takes a new wife, and as you expect, the new wife gets all the good stuff, and so the law requires the husband not to deprive his first wife of food, clothing, and intimacy. And if he breaks that vow, then the first wife is free to leave, obtain a certificate of divorce, and remarry. Over time, these two texts, Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 24, became the two pillars texts that rabbis used for governing divorce, with the understanding that marriage involves a vow to be faithful, no sexual immorality, to provide food and clothing, and to love, intimacy, and affection. When these vows are broken, the victim has the right to divorce and remarry. There's no such thing in Judaism as a divorce that did not include the right to remarry. That was the intent behind the certificate. Now, rabbis would debate what constituted the breaking of these vows because they took them very seriously. So the question is, did rabbis believe the law of Moses included things like abandonment or abuse? And the answer is absolutely. Abandonment would be the extreme form of breaking the vow to provide, and abuse would be the extreme form of breaking the vow to love. In Israel, those were also acceptable grounds for divorce. Once again, this did not mean that God thought divorce was a good idea. I mean, he didn't. However, this was a means of preventing even greater injustice when vows were broken. Now, as Nate shared though, in Jesus' day, there was a new development when it came to divorce. Two of the most famous rabbis who dominated the religious scene a few decades prior, they were named Hillel and Shammai. And they were both kind of like rock stars in the rabbi world, if you will. And schools were founded around them to interpret the law of Moses. And so Hillel, he came up with a new kind of divorce called the any cause. And where did he get this idea from? Well, Deuteronomy 24. Rabbis, they loved the law of Moses, they loved every word, and they believed that not a single word was random or redundant. And so when Hillel read Deuteronomy 24, where Moses says a man can divorce his wife for the cause of sexual immorality, his conclusion was that Moses could have simply said a man can divorce his wife for sexual immorality. And so the fact that he included the word for the cause suggested to him that there was more than one cause, like many causes. And so Hillel and other rabbis created a list of different causes that they believed a husband could divorce his wife. And the list was extensive. It included things like if she spoiled your dinner, if she walked around with her hair down, if she argued in a voice loud enough to be heard in the house next door. Now, one drawback, however, to this any clause divorce was that it was also expensive. If a husband could prove that his wife had committed adultery in court, then the husband would not have to pay her the marriage inheritance that was promised at their wedding. However, if he had obtained the any clause divorce, then he would have had to pay the inheritance. Nonetheless, the any clause divorce soon became the most popular form of divorce in Israel. Now, despite how common the any clause divorce option had become in Jesus' day, not everyone was receptive to it. Shammai disagreed. He said, no. Deuteronomy 21 refers only to divorce being allowed for sexual immorality. Now, of course, Shammai would have agreed that divorce could also happen on the basis of Exodus 21, where abuse or abandonment were at play. But when it comes to Deuteronomy 24, Shammai said, at any cause divorce is wrong, bad interpretation of the law, that's not correct. So in Jesus' day, this caused a significant debate between the rabbis who followed Hillel and those who followed Shammai. And everyone wanted to know exactly where each rabbi stood on the subject. Unlike today, only men were allowed to initiate divorce, not women. So when women were past their prime, it wasn't uncommon for a man to upgrade to a younger wife, leaving the older wife vulnerable and unprotected. Jesus is not down with that, any of that. And here in the Sermon on the Mount, he's about to weigh in on the Deuteronomy 21 debate. Look at what he says. He says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Jesus is saying, listen, I know that the popular interpretation right now that everybody is following is from the school of Hillel, where you can divorce your wife for any reason, but that's not what Moses or God had in mind. And at face value reading, it sounds like Jesus is saying you can only get divorced if your spouse has an affair, and even then, all remarriage is adultery. However, in this passage, Jesus is not providing an in-depth, comprehensive teaching on divorce and remarriage. Rather, Jesus is weighing in on a raging debate in his day over how to interpret Deuteronomy 24, and he's saying that Hillel's any clause interpretation is way off. Now, if you're not convinced, then look no further than a bit later in Matthew's gospel where he gives greater context. Matthew 19 verse 3 says that some Pharisees came to Jesus to test him and asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? And notice how they're not asking what the Christian church has largely understood the question to be. They're not asking, Rabbi, is divorce against the law? Because that was never debated in Jesus' day. Divorce was in the law of Moses, as we've already looked at, and so no rabbi would ever ask, is it lawful for us to follow Moses' law? Of course it is. What they're asking is, do you agree with Hillel or Shammai's interpretation of Deuteronomy 21? And they're trying to get Jesus into trouble with the authorities because his cousin, John the Baptist, had recently spoken out against the ruler getting an any cause divorce. And guess what happened to him? John was beheaded. And so this was a loaded question, and they knew it. This is why they posed the question to Jesus. And so how does Jesus respond? Well, Jesus goes back to the very beginning of the Torah, quoting Genesis chapter 2, in which he says, haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. Jesus is saying that God's purpose for marriage was that a husband and a wife would make an intimate, permanent commitment that would last a lifetime. So the Pharisees, they responded, well, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? To which Jesus cleverly replies, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Now, because the only grounds Jesus mentions here is adultery, we have traditionally believed that the New Testament position is that the only biblical grounds for divorce are such, which historically has led to a lot of hurt, pain, and confusion in the church, because many would argue, you mean that if my husband beats me, beats our kids, is addicted to drugs and alcohol, or steals money, whatever, I have to stay married to him? But if he strays one time sexually, then I can get a divorce? And Nate shared that he wasn't convinced that this is what Jesus was really saying. In this passage, Jesus is not talking about the whole Jewish framework for marriage and divorce. He's weighing in on the Hillel and Shammai debate. Nate shared that Jesus would have shared the understanding that where the vows of marriage are broken and where there is a hardness of heart, then divorce may well be the only option. You see, another indicator of this is in the Apostle Paul's writings to the church at Corinth. 1 Corinthians 7:15, but if you're married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever leaves, let him do so. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. In other words, if your spouse abandons you, then the marriage is over and you're free to remarry. This is important because Paul would not consider himself to be amending Jesus' one exception found in Matthew 19. He would not consider that he was tacking on additional grounds for divorce, that he was adding abandonment in addition to Jesus' rule of adultery. He would have understood that he and Jesus were in agreement with the Old Testament teaching that marriage is a vow to be faithful, a vow to provide, a vow to love, and that God intended for those vows to last a lifetime. Now, sometimes those vows are broken. But that does not mean that divorce is okay, even in that case. I mean, sometimes in churches, people have been legalistic about this and they've said, my spouse has been unfaithful to me and so now I have the grounds to divorce them. Well, not necessarily. The reason for divorce, according to Jesus, is the hardness of hearts. The idea here is that even if a marriage vow is broken, if a spouse is repentant, soft-hearted, willing to reconcile, and they're willing to rebuild the marriage. But if the spouse, refuses to repent, if they're stubborn and hard-hearted, they reject reconciliation, they reject rebuilding the marriage, it may then be the only option. And so what we see in Scripture is that the breaking of vows in a chronic, hard-hearted spirit appear to be the biblical grounds for divorce. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping discussion questions. I'll see you next time.